Welcome everyone to the IRP seminar series. We are delighted today to have Jeff Larrimore here. He's Section Chief at Consumer and Community Research at the U.S. Federal Reserve Board. And we also are delighted to have his co-author, David Splinter, is currently with us. So he's going to field all the hard questions. And Jacob Mortensen will be joining. As I understand it, they're both at the Joint Committee of Taxation. So one of the upsides of having a virtual seminar series is that we can have more than one presenter to engage us with their work, which is delighted. I also want to cue people up. We have a great talk coming up next week from Jennifer Silva. She's a sociologist at Indiana University, and she has the very exciting title of Pain and Politics in the Heart of America. So we're looking forward to her talk next week. Reminder, the way we're handling questions virtually for this seminar series is that if you have a question, you can either raise your hand as an attendee at the end, but I think it makes most sense for you to type in your questions that come up as you go, and I will interject and try and interrupt Jeff to get those questions of clarification answered. I think bigger discussion questions are better to be held to the end. So with that, I will hand it over to Jeff, and we're delighted to hear his presentation. And again, questions in the chat box that I'll try and get fielded as we go, questions of clarification. Jeff, take it away.
All right, well, thank you very much for having me. While I certainly wish that I could be there in person, I'm glad to have the opportunity to share our work with you today, even if it is virtual. And I'm certainly looking forward to any questions and feedback that you have on this paper. And this is work that I started with Jake Mortensen and David Splinter, both at the Joint Committee on Taxation. And it really is, in many respects, a data development project where we're trying to produce a data set and set the tax data in a way that will then be useful for other researchers. So I'm certainly looking forward to the conversation about it. Before I start, just the standard disclaimer applies at the bottom here that the views in this paper reflect the views of me and my co-authors and shouldn't be attributed to the Board of Governors, the Federal Reserve System, or to the Joint Committee on Taxation. As some background on this paper, so this paper obviously, given the title, has a focus on poverty, but its origins really are actually centered around data and measurement. So there's been this shift in recent years towards using administrative tax data for distributional questions and understanding what the distribution of income looks like in the United States. And this has certainly been incredibly valuable work. So Piketty and Saez back in 2003, I think really kind of spearheaded this line of research and really opened up the doors of using tax data for these types of purposes. More recently, you can certainly think about work like the Opportunity Insights by Raj Chetty and Nathan Hendren and John Friedman and their co-authors looking at things like intergenerational mobility. But while there's a few exceptions, including certainly some of Raj Chetty's work, most of this work has focused on the top of the income distribution rather than the bottom of the distribution. And so what we were really interested in trying to do is develop the tax data in a way that makes them more useful for questions around what's going on at the lower end of the income distribution. And so there's some important limitations of using tax data to be able to look at low-income individuals, and I'm going to get to that in just a couple of slides. And I think that's kind of one of the big data development pieces of this paper. But part of why I think that it's particularly useful to be able to think of these administrative data for these purposes is that they actually have some really useful aspects that are helpful for thinking about poverty and poverty dynamics. So a big one certainly is the fact that there's expectations of less measurement error in the data because there are financial repercussions. A lot of the information is actually being reported directly by by government agencies, for example, about Social Security benefits and other government benefits. But the other big one is that the tax data represent actually a very large naturally occurring panel. People file tax returns every year or almost every year. There's some people who don't file every year, but almost every year people are filing tax returns. And this allows us to use these data to think about the dynamics of poverty and trends over time in a long run sense following the same individuals that are just much harder to do using survey data. With that being said, I think that so we certainly are building off of the extensive literature that's thinking about poverty dynamics using some of the panel surveys that exist, including the SIP and the PSID. Ann Huff-Stevens' paper in 1999, I think, was a sort of really big building block for us as we're thinking about this paper. Because part of what we're trying to do, recognizing that this is a new data set that we're developing for these purposes, or extending this data set for these purposes, is making sure that what we're finding are consistent with what our expectations might be and what people have found elsewhere, as we're arguing that these data can be used for this purpose. So just to give you a idea of the research question we're focusing on and a preview of our results before getting into the details. So the first question, actually not even on here, is, before we even get to the specifics of poverty dynamics, is what I alluded to on the last slide, which is, are we actually able to use the tax data to look at poverty questions? And here I think that the answer is yes, and hopefully I'll be able to convince you of that as I go through the talk today. But then in thinking about what we actually are seeing in terms of the specifics of poverty and tax data, the first question we're going to look at is, how did tax policies affect poverty around the Great Recession? And what we see is actually that the tax policies really make a difference. And in the tax data, we see that pre-tax poverty rose by about 1.5 percentage points over the 4 years from 2007 to 2011. Whereas once we factor in tax and look at post-tax poverty, it rose by much less. And that's just very consistent with the fact that a lot of the social safety net programs and social spending have been occurring through the tax code. That during the Great Recession, there were things like the stimulus payments. We expanded the earned income tax credit. There are payroll tax holidays. So a lot of these programs are going on through the tax code. So we should be paying attention to that as we think about these policies. Then the second question is using the fact that we are able to look at the same individuals over a long period of time. And so we then ask how many people are experiencing poverty over a decade-long period that we're exploring. It's actually 12 years, 2007 to 2018. And what we see is that 42% of people spent at least 1 year in poverty once incorporating taxes over that period. So poverty really is touching a pretty sizable share of the population. This naturally does mean that, given that it's so much higher than the annual cross-sectional poverty, that a lot of this poverty is somewhat transitory, that people are going in and out of poverty. But there also are a lot of people who are experiencing poverty over a number of years during this period. So of people who are poor in 2007, 1/3 of them were poor for at least half of the years through 2018. And I mentioned Stevens' paper a minute ago. This is actually very much almost the same poverty persistence findings that she found. She found using data from the 1970s and 1980s that about 1/3 of people were poor in 1 year, were then poor for 5 of the next 10 years. So a pretty similar result. So I think this is actually very consistent with the types of results that she was finding. So where I started with this was saying that this is, in many respects, it has origins as a data paper, and trying to think about what we're able to say using the tax data to look at low-income populations. And there really are two main reasons that we see and are trying to address in this paper about why people haven't been using the tax data more to look at low-income individuals. So the first one is challenges with non-filers. So the most common data source that people are using on the tax side to be able to look at income distributions is the individual tax return data from the IRS statistics of income. And the problem with this as a data source for looking at poverty is about 10 to 15% of adults don't file a tax return each year. And these people aren't just missing at random. It's mostly low-income individuals. Married couples, for example, in 2017, typically weren't required to file below, if their income was below about $20,000. So there are certainly some people with lower incomes who are filing, but you're not necessarily required to. And as a result, you're just going to be missing a lot of people in that area, that section of the distribution. And so the traditional workarounds for this that people have used is either just ignore the problem and only discuss filers. I actually think that that's a pretty unsatisfactory solution generally, but particularly if you're looking at something like poverty, that becomes just extremely problematic. Or the other approach that is somewhat more common is to just impute non-filer tax units and focus on people higher in the income distribution. So for example, just saying, well, we know that there are 10 million people who didn't file a tax return, and we're going to assume that they each have an income that's 20% of the median income in the United States and call it a day. Again, I think that at least helps with the overall distributional problems, but if the question is what is going on for poverty and for low-income individuals, just imputing the entire bottom of the distribution isn't going to solve that. So our approach here is going to be to use information return incomes that even if you don't actually file a tax return, the IRS actually receives a lot of information about your incomes on forms such as a W-2, and on things like 1099 forms that government agencies are sending to the IRS. So we're able to get a lot of income information from those as well, and be able to get a sense of what people's actual incomes look like.
Jeff, this is Catherine. We have a clarification question. Of those 10 to 15% that are non-filers, Lois Miller, one of our great graduate students, wants to know how many of them were not required to file versus how many just didn't do it even though they were required to.
I don't know the exact breakdown off the top of my head. The majority of them, and David Splinter, if you know the answer to that, you're welcome to jump in as well here. I believe that the vast majority of them are not required to file. I don't know the actual number, but it's almost certainly a majority, and I expect that it's far more than that.
Yeah, I think one thing we can say is that it's mostly retirees, and the retirees are just getting Social Security income that's not really taxable. So I think you're right. It's probably the majority, and it's that group of people.
Thanks, David. Then the other challenge with the tax data, which gets way less attention, but is actually, I think, very much related to that, and this is really where our main focus has been, is the sharing unit, and who you're actually sharing your resources with. So if you're using the IRS tax data, we actually are only going to observe you, or traditionally, you would only be observed with people who actually file a tax return with. So this is what we'll refer to as a tax unit. So this is going to be you as an individual, your spouse if you're married and you file a joint tax return, and any dependent children who also you're then reporting on your tax return with you. And it's actually different from either a family or a household. So for income distribution research, frequently we focus on the household, which is everyone that's living with you. A lot of poverty measurement is based on the family, and so census family definition is anyone who's living with you that's related by blood or marriage. And so you can certainly think about then how there's going to be lots of people, adult children, for example, who are living with you, might be sharing resources, and they would be part of your family for poverty measurement purposes and be part of your household, but aren't going to show up on the same tax return. And so the ways that people have typically dealt with this is just focusing on tax units. If you actually do that, a lot of people who, one of the groups that you'll be, I mentioned the adult children, people who are right out of college and living with parents, people who are college students, for example, and but may not be claimed as dependent if they're filing independently. Those are people who would often have low incomes and are going to appear poor even if they're living in a higher income family and a higher income household. So people frequently then just sort of having this focus on tax units. Frequently, this comes with an implicit assumption that these are actually all the same thing. And one of the things I'll show you is that these really aren't. And so our approach is then going to be using the fact that every tax form has an address on it. So we're able to link all individuals with the same physical address together to be able to then see see who people are living with and link people together. And this actually becomes also very important as you're thinking about the non-filer problem, because if you think about somebody who, I said that we're able to get information from W-2s and from other forms that the IRS receives, but those are all based completely on the individual. And if you're then trying to use these data to be able to look at what, put those people into the distribution, you actually need to know who is it that they're sharing resources with, who should we be linking them together with, because you don't necessarily want two non-filers who are married to each other, to be showing up independently. We need to be able to put them together into a broader household or a broader sharing unit. So the data that we're going to be using is the population level data from the IRS. And what we actually are then going to see is for every single person in the United States who files a tax return, we have an anonymized version of their tax forms. This includes the Form 1040 that they're filing each year to the IRS. It also includes information returns that are filed to the IRS on that person's behalf. So this would include the W-2 forms from an employer, things like the SSA 1099, which is how Social Security Administration reports Social Security income, the unemployment income on 1099 forms. So any income, or not, almost any income that is taxable or potentially taxable, the IRS is receiving information from employers and from other agencies about what this income actually is then looking like. But I want to be very upfront, because about what it is that we're actually missing here. Because I think this is actually one of the other reasons why people have sometimes steered away from using tax data for looking at poverty, is this question of what income is not actually going to be included in the tax data because it's not taxable. And so income that doesn't show up in the tax data will certainly include AFDC and TANF income. It includes SSI income, workers' compensation, child support, educational assistance, and other financial assistance. So those are the income sources that show up in the current population survey that don't show up on tax forms at all. And these are definitely important for thinking about low-income individuals, but it actually is, I mean, it's certainly a relatively small share of total income. So this chart shows the income, total income in 2010 by income source in the IRS compared to the current population survey. So you can sort of run through this and see for total earnings, the IRS actually has slightly more total earnings than the CPS is reporting. For other private income, it actually is far higher. The CPS has a known problem of undercounting income of retirees and pension income in particular. So B and Mitchell had a paper a couple years ago really focusing on some of those limitations. So the IRS has about 600 billion, these are all in millions of dollars. So That's a $600 billion difference in pension income, aggregate pension income in the IRS compared to the CPS. But the tax data also has more unemployment compensation, social security income. Because we're getting the information directly from or taxpayers are getting it directly from government agencies. They're reporting if they don't file, we're using the what's reported to the IRS directly. We have about $50 billion more unemployment compensation in the tax data, about $100 billion more social security income. And then all those income sources I said that I'm missing, so things like the welfare, the AFTC and TANF income, Social Security, workers' compensation, those all total about $200 billion. So it's about 2 to 3% of total income that is in one of these sources of income that it shows up in the CPS but does not show up on the IRS side. But I think that is counterbalanced in many respects by some of these other income sources that are theoretically showing up in both places, but we have better information on from the IRS. So just to give you so the other aspect of this on the data side, before getting to this question of how our sort of our creation of households and things about poverty is the total population. And one of the other concerns that you might have about using the tax data is the fact that there are people who may legitimately have no income and they just aren't showing up in the tax data at all. And so what this chart shows is the total number of people, millions of people in the IRS data compared to the current population survey and compared to the American Community Survey. So typically we see 1 to 2% fewer people in the IRS compared to the American Community Survey. It's closer to, and actually sometimes slightly above, the current population survey population counts. But remember that the current population survey is going to exclude people in institutional populations. So we remove, what we'll do in the IRS is we remove anyone that's living in a household with at least 11 people to kind of try to approximate some of those group quarters. And we also have to drop anyone that we don't have an address for. So this leaves us about 3% below the CPS population counts. You'll notice in 2017 and 2018 in particular, but also a little bit in years before that, that there has been a little bit of a drop off in the IRS. That really has to do with the fact that some people haven't filed their tax returns yet. But there are people who file their tax returns late, and they just aren't in the data yet. So my expectation is that that will close over time as the late filers come in. But so 1 to 2% is compared to the ACS, or 3% compared to the CPS. It's certainly way better than missing 10 to 15% of the population, but it's not perfect. So who are these people that we're missing? In general, it's going to be people who have no income. They have no income, are not independent, and are also not a college student. So if you have income, if you're a dependent, I already talked about them. And if you're a college student, we also get a form, the 1098-T, if you're interested in your tax forms, that says that you paid tuition, so we know you exist. So we can see that you exist and are in our data set, even though you have no income sources. So those people will be missing if you don't have any of those, or people who only have under the table income, because we're only seeing reported income. And as I said, we also throw out people who have invalid data because we need an address to be able to link you to other people in your household. And so the way that we then will account for these people is we will, because we know that there are some true zeros that exist in the data. So we'll assume that the CPS is accurately capturing the number of people with zero incomes. And through this, we'll then impute 4 to 5 million more people in zero income households to match the CPS zero counts as well. And this is consistent with the way that Chetty and Hendren are treating people that they're seeing with no income in their data as well. and I'll skip over this, but just give you a quick sense of what this looks like when we then add back into group quarters. As I said, we're now typically kind of 1 to 2%. We were 3% below the CPS, and we're now kind of closing that gap basically in half by pulling in the zeros that the CPS has that we think we are actively missing in the IRS data. So with that in mind, it's sort of in terms of sort of the background of the data, and as I said, I know that I'm spending probably more time on this data, and we'll get to sort of the poverty piece as well. The other piece of this then is actually linking people into households. And so the way that we're going to do this is what we call the tax household sample. So we had previously completed this for 2010. That was really trying to do this kind of as a proof of concept and showing that this is something that we theoretically can actually do. We can make these links and get reasonable results. And so we now extended it here to cover the period from 2007 to 2018. And so what we're actually going to be doing here is for every tax form, it contains a mailing address. So we'll clean all of these addresses to a uniform style. So you can think about the fact that some people will write out the word street in their address. Some people abbreviate it ST. Some people will write out first street. Other people will use the number. So we do all of these cleanings to get it into a uniform style. And then we link together all tax returns that have the same mailing address and zip code. So using this address information, putting together people together into the same physical address. This is all self-reported by taxpayers, so you can imagine that this is messy data. And there are going to certainly be typos and other errors that people include. So the way that we address that is for anyone who doesn't link to another tax unit, there's a potential that the reason you're not linking is because you have a typo in your address. So we take the entire IRS address information, and we can then compare it to a street address list that we have that has every valid street name and zip code combination that exists in the United States to determine whether the address that people provided is actually a valid street name and zip code combination. And so we can then use that if people are entering in a street that doesn't exist. We basically are doing a distance comparison of how far off is what they entered from a valid street name that's in their zip code to be able to say this is what it looks like their street name probably should have been. And for the most part, all of these, a very large fraction of them are people who were just off by a letter or they were missing a letter in it, so are relatively straightforward. And then we'll also, as I mentioned, we'll drop households with at least 11 people to approximate group quarters, and also to try to deal with the fact that you might have some cleaning that fails and causes people to be linked into households that are larger than they should be. One very specific aspect of that household sort of group quarters aspect and concerns about overlinking that has come up a bunch is concerns about apartment buildings. And what happens if people just forget to enter the apartment building that they live in. And so what we actually do there is just because that is something that has come up a lot in conversations about it, is if you enter a street address where at least one other person at that address lists an apartment number and you don't, we don't let you link with anyone else. So that way, if you have a big apartment building and there's 5 people at this address who all fail to enter in their actual apartment numbers, they're not going to just get linked into a household. They will be kept separately to keep it cleaner. And so what does that then actually do? So this slide is important for our household creation, and it shows you just how different tax units are for families and households. So the top orange dashed line is the total number of tax units in the United States. So there were 173 million tax units in the United States in 2018. And you can compare that to the number of families that the CPS has. There were about 145 million families, so 28 million fewer families than there were tax units. And if you then are thinking about households, there were between 120 and 130 million households. And so we actually feel pretty good about our household counts, that we're actually right between the CPS and the ACS in terms of the number of households. In 2018, we estimated 124 million households in the IRS data compared to 129 million in the CPS and 122 million in the ACS. And there's some researchers, McHugh, Masnick, and Herbert a couple of years ago, who did a comparison of the household count, because it's actually pretty, I was pretty surprised by how wide this divergence was between the number of households in the CPS and ACS actually. And they argue that due to differences in weighting and differences in reference periods and as a result, vacancy rates, that the ACS probably is underestimating the total number of households in the US, and the CPS is probably overestimating. So the fact that we're actually kind of right between the two is pretty comforting in terms of the quality of our household creation. And so kind of one last thing before I shift and think some about what we're seeing using these data to think about poverty is why we should care about this for poverty measurement. And the reason it's particularly important for poverty measurement is that the tax units who are living with others are very frequently lower in the income distribution. So this figure on the x-axis is the income centile of people's tax units, and then it's for each centile the share of tax units that are living with at least one other tax unit in their household. And so in the lower half of the distribution, excuse me, in the lower half of the distribution, over half of tax units are living in 2 or plus tax unit households. So very frequently, these people are actually living with people who they're not actually filing a tax return with. The multiple tax unit households also is an issue higher up in the distribution. You can still see that even in the top decile, about a third of these tax units are living with at least one other tax unit in the same household. But it's particularly an issue lower in the distribution, and that's why we think that this is important to be paying attention to. I will actually kind of pause here just for a second, just because I certainly recognize that poverty is frequently measured at the family level rather than the household level. I would love to be able to actually create families in the way that the CPS thinks about families. That's something that unfortunately you just can't do in the tax data. But then as we're thinking about what is actually closer in concept to what we're trying to be paying attention to, the household certainly feels much closer than the tax unit is. And it also feels consistent with the way that people using other data sources have thought about it, and frequently going to the household as the best available option if necessary. And so just to kind of summarize the data side, and then I'll move on to what we're finding in terms of poverty. I think that the big advantage of these data is that it is sort of this nearly population level data. So we're able to actually be looking at even low incidence events. We focus specifically here on poverty questions, but I think it's useful for other ones as well. And then what we actually are specifically using is the fact that we have this naturally occurring panel, and the fact we have somewhat fewer concerns about reporting error. So moving on from kind of this idea of the data development side to what we're actually measuring and seeing for poverty. So the way that we're going to be measuring poverty here is using tax return income. So our income definition is going to be, we're looking both at pre-tax and after-tax income reported on the tax forms. We're excluding capital gains. And as I mentioned earlier, we are missing cash transfers that aren't on tax returns. I'll show you in a couple slides that this actually seems to matter for the level of poverty. Seems to matter somewhat less for the trend in poverty, although certainly who's in poverty will vary some there. And then we're going to use the standard square root of household size equivalent scale to get everything just into a standard measure. So rather than trying to do the precise family size adjustments of poverty thresholds, we'll basically just scale it all using the square root of household size. It pretty closely matches the size adjustment in the official poverty measure. On the household side, or sorry, on the threshold side, we know that the IRS captures more income at the bottom of the distribution than the CPS. I showed you the overall summary table that the IRS captures just more income generally. It also does so lower in the distribution. And one of the things that we actually want to be really sensitive to is not defining people out of poverty just because we have somewhat different ability or somewhat better ability to capture income and a different data source that we're thinking of households rather than families. So because the IRS has more income than the CPS does, we're going to shift poverty thresholds up slightly in order to keep the share of people in poverty in 2007 the same. And this is actually, in some respects, a systematic way of making the similar type of adjustment to what PSID researchers have often done to reflect that the PSID captures more income than the CPS. So PSID researchers often will shift poverty thresholds up by 25% to reflect the fact that they are getting more income than the CPS and don't want to basically be defining people out of poverty. And we're doing that in a similar way, but rather than just saying we're going to adjust the thresholds by 25%, we're saying what do we need to adjust them to get the same exact poverty rate in 2007 that you see in the CPS data. And I think this is also consistent with the way that Citra and Michael in their National Academy of Sciences report thought about this, that they were pretty explicit that you really should be changing resources and needs together. And so we're trying to then do that by making this adjustment when we're pretty explicitly getting more resources, thinking about after-tax poverty in addition to pre-tax poverty, and trying to be responsive to that concern. The one other thing in terms of the thresholds, so as I said, we matched the rate to 2007. So we set our threshold so we get the same rate in 2007. And then in all subsequent years, we just adjust the threshold using the CPIU in the same way that the official measure does. So what does that actually then do in practice to our poverty thresholds? So this is to give you a pretty clear crosswalk from what the thresholds look like in the official measure to our thresholds using the IRS data. So in 2007, the official poverty measure, when you looked at families, said that the pre-tax cash income, the threshold was $21,200. If in the CPS we kept the same poverty rate, but we switched to households in the same income definition, that would shift the threshold up by about $800. When we then move to the income that shows up on tax returns and the fact that we are missing things like the workers' compensation income and cash welfare, that shifts it back down by about $1,000. And then when we shift to the IRS data, it shifts it back up by another 900. So this actually looks very similar to the poverty threshold that you have for families in the official poverty measure. It's only $600 different, but there's a lot that's going on in there in terms of why it's not just a straight adjustment, that there's a number of different steps that are going on to get to that different rate. And then, as I said, because we are using tax data and have to focus on some tax issues in order to be able to use it, we also are interested in after-tax poverty. And when we look at after-tax poverty, again, we're trying to maintain that same threshold. People at this point in the income distribution frequently are receiving things like the earned income tax credit. And so with because of that, when you actually reflect federal tax credits and federal tax liabilities, they actually frequently have slightly more income, so the threshold actually goes up a little bit when we switch to the after-tax measure. So with all of that in mind, in terms of how we actually went about creating our poverty series in the tax data, this is what the trend then looks like for poverty rates when we look at these single one-year cross sections. So as I said, by construction, 2007 is set to be the exact same poverty rate. But then what we see actually that I was not necessarily expecting, but I think is interesting, is the fact that the IRS data shows a somewhat flatter trend in poverty over the course of the Great Recession than the CPS data does. So the black dotted line is the official poverty rate just taken directly from what the Census Bureau reports. The gray line is when I switch, I'm using the CPS data, but I switch to households and switch to our tax return income concept. And you can see that really, once we anchor 2007 to maintain the rate, that really didn't make much of a difference at all in terms of what the poverty trends are looking like, switching to households and switching to our tax return income. But when we switched the data source, the IRS data actually did. And so part of this is coming because the tax data are doing a better job of capturing unemployment insurance in particular. So I showed you early on that the IRS in 2010 had an extra $50 billion of unemployment income. And because the IRS is actually getting this information directly for non-filers, and people are required to report the unemployment insurance on their tax forms, more unemployment insurance is showing up, and there was the steep increase in unemployment insurance over the Great Recession as more people were out of work. And as a result, that causes some of this flattening. I don't want to overstate this of this difference in the trend from sort of 2007 through 2011. About a quarter of it is we can attribute specifically to unemployment insurance. The rest of it is coming from other differences in terms of just the shape of the income distribution in the tax data and the way people's incomes were fluctuating over the Great Recession. But unemployment insurance definitely is one of these contributing factors. When we then switch to thinking about after-tax income, there it actually it flattens even further, reflecting the fact that a lot of the tax policies were, a lot of the policies to alleviate the pressure on families during the Great Recession was focused on the tax code and these changes in the tax system. So there were, again, the payroll tax holidays in particular. There were the stimulus payments in 2008. And also the earned income tax credit expansion to have additional benefits for families with 3 children. And all of these would be having the effect of mitigating the increase in poverty over the Great Recession if you actually are incorporating them into the income measures that we're focusing on. And so this is something that I think, to me, I certainly expected the flattening. I did not expect it to flatten to the extent that it does. And so just to kind of give you to quantify this, here's a table that shows the poverty rates in 2007, 2009, and 2011, and the changes for each of those years using some of these different poverty measures. So the post-tax poverty measure in the IRS, the lower the sort of fourth line down of the green in green here, from 2007 2009, poverty actually declined from 2007 2009, and then by 2011 it had only gone up by 0.3 percentage points since from 2007 to 2011. But then one of the things, as a comparison point, I was then interested in how does this compare to the supplemental poverty measure in particular. And supplemental poverty measure is definitely flatter from 2007 2009 than the official measure is. But it went up by, certainly went up by, was still going up. It went up by more than our post-tax measure did. And definitely when you're looking at 2007 to 2011, it went up by 1.6 percentage points compared to our 0.3. But part of the reason for that is because there's a lot of other differences that are going on with the SPM. In particular, the fact that it's not using an absolute scale to adjust the poverty threshold. We're using the CPIU to adjust each year as opposed to doing it based on people at the 30th to 36th percentile of the income distribution. But Chris Weimer and Liana Fox and their co-authors have a really nice paper where they are taking supplemental poverty measure, they create the historical series and also anchor it in 2012 and say, okay, what would happen if we use this and just adjusted based on the CPIU? We also then took this and did an anchoring back in 1968 in some earlier works. So I started showing both of these here. And what you see is that our post-tax measure, where it declined by a fraction of a percentage point from 2007 to 2009, is actually in line with what they are seeing using their anchored SPM measures. So I think this actually it did give me some comfort in terms of the quality of using IRS data for these purposes, that we actually seem to be somewhat consistent with what they're finding when using this anchored SPM. And of course, again, the SPM, it's post-tax, it's trying to be capturing, it actually captures certainly more. So I think that it's not a perfect comparison, as there's things like food stamps and SNAP benefits that are included in the SPM as well. But I think that it shows that this idea that poverty was relatively flat when using the tax data and after-tax method is consistent with some of these other findings. So then the final piece of in thinking about cross-sectional poverty before moving and thinking about some of the poverty dynamics and trends over and long-run poverty is what's happened by age. And so here we can think about the fact that a lot of our tax policies are focused on families with children, so the earned income tax credit in particular, but also the child tax credit. And so here we're still anchoring 2007 to be 12.5% in the national distribution, but not for each of the age groups. And you can see that you then have this compression of what poverty rates look like, where child poverty rate is still certainly the highest, but it's not quite as extreme as when you look at pre-tax poverty relative to people who are in older age ranges. So now I want to go ahead and spend sort of the last 10 minutes or so, and then opening up for sort of turning to questions, thinking about what we see in terms of poverty dynamics and the likely share of people who are in poverty over time, over a longer period, over a longer time horizon than a single year. So this chart just shows, we took the full period from 2007 to 2018 and said what share of people are ever in poverty over that entire window. And obviously it's this full year period, so there are certainly going to be people who are poor for sort of fractions of years and things like that. But over an entire tax year, tax calendar year, what share of people were poor at least 1 year, that 12-year period. And what we see is that 42% of people spent at least 1 year below our after-tax poverty threshold. This is consistent with the fact that poverty rates are higher for children. This is highest for children and young adults in particular. So part of that, this is going to be people who are right out of college, for example, or didn't go to college but left, have moved out of their parents' house and are just starting off. But you see that of children and young adults, it's even higher. But even among working age people, 39% of people ages 25 to 54 were poor for at least 1 year, and 36% of elderly people were poor for at least 1 year. We also, thinking about marital status, see that this is even higher if you're looking at single adults, and particularly single adults with children, that just over half of single adults with no children were poor for at least 1 year, and 57% of single adults with kids. And so part of the reason why we have are going to have such a high rate of share of people who are poor for at least 1 year relative to the share who are poor for in any single year has to be because you have some level of transitory poverty. People are shifting in and out of poverty. And so what we can do is we can look at, of people who were poor in 2007, what share of them were then in poverty in each subsequent year. So this isn't requiring a continuous poverty spell. This is just what share of them were in poverty in each subsequent year. So of people who were in poverty in 2007, 57% were in poverty in 2008, 46% were in poverty in 2009. So even 2 years later, over half of people were no longer in poverty. But a decade later, in 2017, we still were seeing over a quarter saying who were in poverty in 2007, then being in poverty again in 2017. Some of which is going to be continuous poverty, but a lot of it will be people who escaped poverty and then fell back into it. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time sort of dwelling on this slide, but I think a natural question is, to what extent is this unique to 2007? And the answer is it's not. If we choose different starting years, we can't go as far into the future, but we see very similar patterns if we start the series in 2009, 2011, or 2013. And then also we can also think about breaking this down by age and how persistent is poverty for people of different age ranges. And I think this is actually pretty important because one of the things that we see in the cross section is that elderly poverty is lower than it is for younger adults and for children. But we also see, when we then look at it over time, that the persistence of poverty and the likelihood of remaining in poverty is the highest for older adults. So while people who are ages 65 and older are the least likely to be poor in the cross section, if they are poor, it's more likely to persist into future years. And so to then sort of formalize this and sort of quantify the numbers behind these charts, the way that I like to think about this is how many years do people spend in poverty if they were in poverty in 2007 over the next decade? And so I started off, as I was previewing the results, saying that a third of people who were in poverty in 2007 spent at least half of the dozen years in poverty. And so that's what you can see in the two orange cells at the top here, that 24% of people who were in poverty in 2007 were in poverty for 6 to 9 years. Another 9% were in poverty for at least 10 years. So on average, people who were poor in 2007 spent 4.5 years over the 12-year period in poverty. So about a third of the period. You can then look at that same thing by age. And when we split it by age, what you see is similar to what I showed on the slide before, where people who are ages 65 and older, they were in poverty in 2007, spend somewhat spend a somewhat larger share of the next dozen years in poverty. So on average, they're spending about 5 years out of the 12 years in poverty, whereas young adults are the least likely to be poor in subsequent years, in particular, the least likely to be poor for at least 10 years. So they have 3.9 years out of the 12 years that they're spending in poverty on average. So the last chart that I want to show you, and just to be sort of recognizing this difference between the sort of people-centric measures and the share who are poor in subsequent years, even if it's not continuous, versus a focus on the length of poverty spells. And so here I've shifted from the starting year from 2007 to 2008, because by doing that, I actually can see whether people are in poverty in 2007, and can know then whether the poverty spell actually started in 2008. So the red line at the top is basically just what I showed you before. So this is the share who are poor in subsequent years, but not necessarily continuously. So about a quarter of people a decade later were in poverty, but not necessarily continuously so. If I look at everyone who was poor in 2008, we do see that the length of those poverty spells is falling off more steeply, and particularly if you're looking just at new poverty spells. So about 2/3 of poverty spells end within 3 years, and just about 5% are lasting a decade. But I think that one of the really important takeaways here is that just because a person's individual poverty spell ended does not mean that they are now going to be doing well financially for the rest of their life, and or we don't need to worry about them. A lot of people are shifting in and out of poverty status, and going from being in poverty to not in poverty, and then coming back in. And that's why you see these two lines diverging, is because the red line is reflecting the people who escaped poverty but then fell back into it, whereas the black and light blue lines are only focusing on the continuous poverty spell, and are what you would get if you just said, look, the poverty spell ended, and we're not going to worry about include that person anymore going forward. So just to conclude here, and then happy to use the remainder of the time for questions. So as I said, we had built this tax household sample previously for 2010. We extended it now for a period from 2007 to 2018. And this is something that we really want people to use. I'm not going to pretend that it's easy to get access to IRS data, although I'm expecting there should be a call for proposals later this year. I'll sort of end after this slide on some information on data access. But if you're able to get access to IRS data, we really would love for you to be able to use this data and think about what sort of questions to be able to answer. But thinking about the specifics of poverty using the tax data, what we see is that the taxes definitely matter for poverty trends, that we have a much flatter trend over the Great Recession when we look at after-tax poverty relative to pre-tax poverty. But we also see just how widespread poverty can be, and how many people are actually touched by it, at least for 1 year. So this idea that 42% of people spend at least a year in poverty is, I think, pretty striking. But also, while a lot of people who experience poverty, it is transitory, we do also see evidence of people who are consistently struggling with it, and then the fact that a third of people who are poor in 2007 were then poor for at least half a dozen years does point to the fact that there also is this the share of the population who's just consistently struggling with it. So with that, I'll just sort of turn to a data access slide to give you a little bit of a link and some information if you are interested in using this data. But with that, I'm then happy to go ahead and just open it up to any questions everyone has.
Great. And Jeff and David, I invite you to, David and Jacob, if you're there, to join in. So we have a question that's related to data, so I'll start with that one. Someone asks whether, it acknowledges this is a little bit outside the scope, but if you're concerned about non-filers and not capturing non-taxable income such as SSI, would it be possible to merge in IRS data with SSA data?
Yeah, and I think that that is something that is potentially possible. Right now, our data access is purely within the tax world, so we don't have the ability right now to be able to do those merges. There are certainly researchers who are taking a different approach and starting with the census data and trying to merge in tax data in that direction is another approach to do that. But yes, there theoretically are possibilities for creating those data linkages. Part of that is then just figuring out what the data agreements are and getting all the appropriate parties on board with it.
So maybe more in theory than in practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in practice, yes, it's just not there yet. I think that the government agencies are trying to get much better at data sharing and these data sharing agreements, but it's just not fully there. Great.
And Tim's meeting wants to know what the effects of the child tax credit, the EITC. I think this is in, he didn't write a full question, but I think he's referencing the difference between pre-tax and post-tax poverty rates, and if you had attributed it to the child tax credit or the EITC or some other tax transfer.
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you, Tim, for suggesting that. We haven't actually tried to break it out and do the separate components of taxation individually, but I certainly see the value in that and why you'd be interested in that, and that's something that I think we would be able to do.
Yeah. So I want to invite others to either raise their hand and ask questions or type them into the Q&A. And Jeff, I'll just throw out a softball. I also am surprised at how high the rates of the persistence of poverty are over time. And I'm wondering to what extent you think it's likely due to the recession itself, or, I mean, have you compared this with other estimates from, say, the PSID or different historical time periods?
Yeah, so the work that I talked about by Anha Stevens, and we're very consistent with her in terms of the share of people who are in poverty for extended periods of time. Mm-hmm. She doesn't actually report the share who are ever in poverty over the decade, but it's actually, I mean, it's given her findings on the share of people who have extended poverty, that should actually pretty much fall straight out of that. You can think about, I'll go back a couple slides here. So the average of 4.5 years that people spend in poverty over the decade. So people are spending about a third of the time in poverty. And you can then think about the poverty rate in any single year is in the order of about 12%. So if everyone who is poor spends about a third of the time in poverty, it should be about 3 times that. So, it does seem consistent there.
Okay, so it's pretty consistent. And have you looked at how much it really is people just bouncing around the poverty line versus, right? So say more about, I guess what I'm asking is sort of how you think this might differ from a period of non-recession, right? I mean, it was a unique period. So I guess that's what I'm trying to get at. Were there real big income shocks, or does it just look like people are bouncing around and it's not so different from earlier time periods?
So I'm going to sort of put a shout out to David here if he wants to weigh in. He might. I have not seen us doing it. Splitting it by sort of the first 4 or 5 years versus the next 5 years. I don't know whether he has run that. If he has, certainly speak up, David.
I guess I could try and answer a slightly different question or thought, and that's so a lot of these wage shocks or income shocks are on the extensive margin. So whether you're working or not how much you're working or how much you're getting paid. And so I think what's going on is people are, not working for a year and then they get back into the labor force. And that's where a lot of these bounces happen. And what happens is there's more of those bounces, obviously, during a recessionary period when the unemployment rate goes up. But it's the same dynamic, that it's working half year or working none of the year to drive you down into poverty.
Thank you. I would like to open it up to other questions that folks may have. Give it a minute for people to find the question area. Okay. Anyone? I'm not seeing hands and I'm not seeing typed questions. Any final words that you'd like to offer? I'd like to thank you. That was a great paper. I'm really pleased that you were able to give it. And I also just want to say great slides too. I love all the graphs. Any final parting words from no?
No, and I just thank you again for inviting me to come and share this work with you. I think that, so as I mentioned, we really did view this as, I think that I have a lot of an interest in sort of poverty and poverty measurement and sort of my focus and what I've been thinking about, but also just creating this data resource. So I did give you the link sort of on the last slide there of the IRS every other year does a call for papers. The last one was 2018. I expect it's going to be this fall. If you are interested in being able to work with these data, I would encourage you to apply, and also just offer that I and Jake and David, I think all three of us have committed to the fact that we're happy to help people trying to work through those applications and being able to get access. So if it's something where, I mean, we have not, I will caveat that with, we understand what they're looking for, but we haven't actually had to go through the process ourselves. But to the extent where it'll be helpful and give advice and thoughts there, definitely reach out and let me know. And because I think that there's a lot that can be done with these, and encourage people to be able to do it.
Great. And Jeff, I apologize. I have one more. Right. So Jeff Smith put both in the chat and the Q&A, which means he really wants me to ask his questions, which, Jeff, I thought I had sort of asked it a different way, but I'm going to ask it just the way you wrote it. How similar to early periods, as in Greg Duncan's book? And David might be the one to answer. He was typing in the answer. So, but let's.
Yeah, I mean, I think my recollection of the Duncan findings from a while back was that people in poverty in 1 year, about half of them are not in poverty the next year. So it was like a 1-to-1 year result that I remember, and our results fit with that, in that we saw 43% leave poverty after 1 year.
I know, which is why I keep being confused, because wouldn't we think it would be worse than earlier periods that were not recessions? But I'm going to let that go, and I'll just think about that myself. Thank you.
Well, and I think that's where.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that's where the fact that, I mean, yes, I would expect that during any time you have economic shocks and disruptions and recessions, and that was a particularly bad one, I would certainly expect somewhat more movement through the distribution. But it's not like when we're looking at our after-tax poverty, we didn't see sort of this major spike in poverty rates. So I think that that's part of it as well, is that the actual poverty rates actually were more flat, and it becomes this question of, do you have, is there just more income volatility that's going on during the recessions? And I think that actually is an important question there to be thinking about too.
Yeah, but just not poverty. And also, right, the distinction between pre-tax versus post-tax and better reported UI and all of that as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so with Jeff's question being asked and answered, we'll let you go, and we thank you very much, and look forward to keeping up with your work, and hopefully circling back sometime when we can actually have you out to Madison. Thanks, Jeff.
Well, thank you very much. This was wonderful. I appreciate it. Have a good day.
You too.